Hi, I'm Prakash. This is part of the faculty student collaborative symposium on learning motor behavior. As part of the symposium, this is the first of the series of short presentations we'll be doing, me and my students. So this part is the introduction to motor behavior. Introduction to learning motor behavior. In this presentation, what I'm going to talk about is uh, I'm going to clarify some of the common terminology and the definitions that are used used within the field of learning motor behavior, right? And uh, and also try to provide some conceptual clarity with which we can go ahead and try implement the fundamental principles of learning motor behavior in our day-to-day practice. This symposium is specifically it's meant to transfer the knowledge of motor learning and behavior to clinical practice. So we'll be talking uh, uh, exactly about the application part of it, but not much of theoretical and conceptual underlying. However, I'll try to provide some fundamental basis of understanding that is required to learn motor behavior. Right. These are the key terminology that are commonly used when it comes to learning motor behavior. Motor learning itself is the common terminology, and you have motor performance, motor development, motor skill, motor behavior, right? Motor behavior, I'm not sure that most of you are familiar with this term, but this is also, but if you read literature, motor behavior is a term that's commonly used. And while these terms are related and a significant part of terminology that are used in motor learning, but they are not same, and it can lead to serious misunderstanding if we assume they all are same. So the first part of presentation, I'm going to try to give a clarity on what it is and what it is not, and also how each term differs from another. Right? So the motor behavior here, the motor behavior can include anything. This is according to Adolf. It's in a recent paper. This is how it was defined. It's in a very broad continuum, like an umbrella term they've used, that motor behavior ranges from involuntary twitches, such as reflexes, to goal-directed actions in every part of the body, from head to toe, in every physical and social context, from solitary play to group interactions. Now, as I said, this is a very broad definitions, an umbrella definition for motor behavior. But in this symposium, we will try to narrow down this definition so that this has a direct impact for contemporary understanding of motor behavior, and especially for physiotherapists. And the motor behavior, first, what I want to emphasize that the motor behavior term and motor skill, these are all more of a similar term rather than trying to define differently. Um, the word motor skill is very commonly used and preferred term in the field of sports and fitness, where they used to have, they call it as a skill, right? So we will define skills slightly differently. But if you read a terminology in a textbook, motor skill or motor behavior, I suggest to look at them more or less similar rather than two different conceptually different terms, right? So motor behavior, the key aspect of motor behavior here is goal-directed movement. Like I said, the previous definition includes everything, but we would want to, we are narrowing down this definition to something that has a direct relevance to physiotherapists. That is, it is a goal-directed movement. What is a goal-directed movement is anything that it is a purposeful, that it is trying to achieve a function, right? Say, for example, walking and drinking water, right? and even running. All of it has a purpose attached to it. And what is not a goal directed movement? Say, for example, if you just do the squeezing, right? Or if you just flex your fingers and straighten. Now, these are all movements, but they are not really a behavior within this definition. Can you understand, right? Because it doesn't have a goal. If you just do it, it doesn't serve any human function that that would help us to uh, function in our real life, right? So the typical movement that many of us are familiar from the anatomy and biomechanics is that flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, and so on. Or if you have read some neurological approaches, you will have the synergistic movement, D1, D2 patterns of PNF and so on. But we must make a distinction between these movements, that is a synergistic movement from PNF or a Bobart approach, or a simple anatomical movement or a reflexes, is that they are not goal directed. That is, performing it does not achieve any function, right? Like a walking, if you walking is a goal directed movement because it helps you to move from one place to another place. So whenever what we are talking about learning motor behavior is, we are trying to talk about learning motor behavior that is in terms of goal directed movements. As I've said, I hope this gives you a clarity. Always think that there is a purpose attached to it, and they are performed voluntarily. So reflexes, we are excluding reflexes or any form of non-voluntary or non-purposeful movement out of motor behavior. So in this entire symposium, whenever we say motor behavior, we mean learning goal-directed movement, which has a purpose attached to it. A motor skill, like I said, we are defining motor skill slightly differently than what they usually talk about in the sports and fitness literature. But we are looking at skill as a quality of indicator of quality of performance rather than as a term that describes the behavior itself. So quality of performance, again, in terms of what? That in terms of consistency with which the goal is achieved. Again, the quality of performance here, keep in mind, because the quality of movement is very commonly used in the field of physiotherapy, especially those who are following a particular school of thought, such as again Bobart or NGT, where quality of movement has been emphasized. In terms of synergy, out of synergy sort of movements, that if the patient performs a synergistic movement and out of synergistic movement, that is a combination of movements are changing, and that is often seen as a indicator of patient getting better. That is, to be specific, using the terms of motor learning here, patient is learning, patient is recovering. You understand? But when we talk about what we are talking about here in learning behavior is quality of performance. Performance means the end goal, not the quality of movement. Can you understand? And this is how that is the major distinction from how we look at patient's problem and what are we trying to learn about learning behavior, right? The idea of quality of movement is long past because it doesn't relate to any function, right? So coming back to quality of performance, right? The extent to which a person can consistently achieve the goal of the task. What we mean by consistently, right? In a sense that patient was repeatedly able to produce a behavior, on every, say, for example, continuously for 2 weeks, or the actual duration depends upon the type of behavior you're trying to understand. But we will say somebody is more skilled because he's able to reproduce that movement on a consistent basis. That is day after day, week after week. So if he's able to do, then it is skilled. So what is less skilled? Sometimes patient is able to walk one day better, next day is not doing well, another day is doing further worse. So these are all typically we will see in early stages of learning, and that is called less skill. So you can determine the quality of performance in terms of skill by the extent to which they are able to produce movement consistently. The other ways of looking at skill is the extent to which a patient can perform the task under range of different conditions. That is the different environmental conditions, or the physical and social context patient is able to, or a person is able to produce that behavior. That is something not just he is able to walk in the clinical setup, or not just he is able to reach for a cup that is placed in a particular height, but he's able to reach for a cup at a different places, or he's able to reach for a water bottle from the fridge, right? So that also one must be able to. We just cannot perform it under one condition, but when the conditions change, that is environmental conditions change, and the person is able to reproduce that behavior even when different condition, under different conditions. That is another indicator of improving the skill in the patient's performance, or in any person's performance. And the third aspect of quality is the degree of efficacy. Now, this is not this is slightly, I mean, from a physiotherapy point of view, we can establish in terms of how well the patient, the person is able to do, right? A task in terms of achievement of the outcome. Now, this is in the slide, what you see is increased muscular effort, deploying information, and so on. But this information is again coming from sports level. So we don't really have to say in terms of force produced, but in terms of, say, for example, lifting a heavy load if it is required, or walking under a condition that really requires them to produce a more intense level of performance, right? So the skill level, the behavior, how we can measure it's changing is these three domains, or these three indicators you can look in terms of consistency of performance, in terms of different range of conditions, and in terms of how well or how difficult if it gets, the patient is, the person is able to perform, right? So like I said, we are defining, even though in many literature, skill and behavior used as a similar term, but in here we want to use the term skill as an indicator of quality of performance of that skill, right? So to just put together, we are defining motor behavior as a goal-directed, purposeful, coordinated movement produced by central nervous system. And the key is central nervous system produces it in its interaction with the rest of the body and environment. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this circles and interacting circles, Venn diagram sort, but this is really important because nervous system doesn't produce behavior on its own. It responds to the changes in the environment, and it produces for a purpose that the individual has. So this is the definition that we are going to work. And in the later part of, in other presentation, you will see how to promote this learning. That's what are different strategies as physiotherapists we can use will be talked about more. So the next, we have looked into motor behavior and motor skills. This is the next common terminology is motor learning. Motor learning is a very common terminology. I can see that in almost every syllabus, at least in postgraduate syllabus, in some courses, it is there. Somewhere here, somewhere or another, the terminology is there. But what actually it is in its simple terms is that we need to understand motor behavior itself. It's a sub-discipline of behavior, that is motor behavior. That in motor we have other sub-disciplines such as motor development and so on, right? Or even motor control for that matter. You have control learning and development and so on, right? So we need to understand learning as a discipline in the motor behavior, but that specifically examines how people acquire and reacquire a skill. Now, acquire in the sense that the first time when you're learning a skill, or reacquire in the sense that you have had an injury or a disease in which you are not able to perform the skill that you want to relearn it, right? So the key is, it is about how, you can say the word is how people acquire it. That is, which means that motor learning is a process, right? So that is what the first thing that we need to understand. Motor learning is a process. And this is the, I think it's a well-known definition. That is, again, I want to emphasize the key term. Almost everything in that definition is very, very key for us to understand. That is, it is relatively permanent change. The word permanent change is important. That is, we can only determine a person has learned a task only when we can be sure that it is now permanent, that it will no longer go back to its original state. Right? I'll explain. I have a more specific analogy to explain this, but keep in mind it has to be permanent change, right? And another key terminology, or the key word that is included in the definition, is it comes as a result of practice or experience. Now, these are all the words that are specifically put so that it can, the motor learning can be distinguished from other terminologies or other aspects, other subdisciplines of motor behavior, such as motor development or other aspect part of learning, which is motor performance. So to emphasize again, that has to be a relatively permanent change, and it has to result from a practice or experience, and it is to be the skill is the ability to execute a motor skill. I think now you know what is a motor skill, right? So this is motor learning. So how does people acquire? What are the process involved in acquiring or reacquiring? What can promote? What can actually affect their ability to learn? These are all the key aspects. As physiotherapists, we need to learn, we need to understand, so that we will come up with some strategies, that is our exercises, in such a way that it can promote learning. At the same time, we will not be indulging in activities that can be detrimental for their learning, right? So if you ask me what are those things that can promote or that can affect learning, we will learn the remaining parts of presentation, which my students will be delivering. They will be talking about several key aspects that can facilitate or that can be a barrier for learning. Right. The motor development, again, it's also a terminology very closely associated with behavior, but we need to know how this can be distinguished from motor learning. That is, the motor development is it looks at the processes. So motor development is also focused on process like learning, but development focuses on processes, that changes that occur over the lifespan, right? And also these changes are resulting from mostly due to maturation of different systems of our body. And you have multiple motor sensory systems and cognitive system, how these systems mature and eventually produce a behavior. And there is a certain amount of learning is also involved, because whatever we acquire as a development, it's not just only because of maturation of different systems, structural or functional systems in the body. It is also because of practice and experience. But this development as a subdiscipline focuses specifically about those system level changes that is developing due to the process of aging. Can you understand? So that is what a motor development is. So then that aging means it occurs across the lifespan, right? So, but if you want to look for a clear distinction, that is, but on the other hand, the learning has to occur as a direct result of practice or experience. Can you understand? But the development has got a lot to do with the processes that is involved in maturation of different systems of our body, and also which happens across the lifespan, right? Say, for example, if you talk about standing and walking, a person really doesn't have to spend, a child will be sitting and crawling, and suddenly one day they will stand. right? But on the other hand, learning has to happen by repeated practice and experience. So they're achieving standing, but if you talk about achieving skills, higher levels of skill learning, which may occur as a result of practice and experience, and that is motor learning, right? I hope this is clear. Now, next is any motor learning text you read, there is a lot of emphasis on what is learning and what is learning and performance, right? So there's always a paragraph that talks about difference between learning and performance, because these two things are different, right? And but it is often people misunderstand. That's why most of the textbooks or talks always emphasize on it. The simple analogy, I think, which is very easy to understand, given by Smith and Lee, Richard Smith, who wrote that famous book, very popular book on motor learning, that motor performance is related to something that is temporary, that what we see during practice or immediately after practice. Okay, but learning, on the other hand, is something related to something permanent, right? So the analogy that he uses is to that boiling an egg, right? You have this water and you have this egg. So if you boil the egg, after certain, like let us say 10-15 minutes, once you remove that heat, what happens is the water temperature comes back to its previous stage, that is the room temperature, right? However, the egg doesn't come back to its previous state. That is, in the egg, because of this heat temperature, the permanent change has taken place, right? However, in the water, the change, whatever that is increase in temperature, was not permanent. As soon as the temperature, the heat is removed, it comes back. So motor learning is something, that's why in the definition is given, it is relatively permanent and the performance is temporary. Now, what is this? Okay, fine, we understand what it is. What's the relevance of this? Is that when we are during clinical practice, when we are training a patient to do some activity, they are getting better, what you're observing clinically, you need to know that it is changes in performance. And what does changes in performance mean? It is temporary. That means, I'm not saying whatever you see is not true or this is some sort of illusion. It's not that, but it requires intense amount of practice for that behavior to become permanent. So that's where the amount of practice and how this practice is done, all are important to transfer this performance into learning. Can understand? So it's just not about what exercises we give, because most often we always there is a far more emphasis on what exercises rather than factors that makes it permanent, because exercise on its own doesn't make a learning, right? You need to practice and conditions, practice condition, all of it is a critical component of making a performance in as a learning, as a permanent behavior. Right? So this is why it's important. We shouldn't get carried away with what we see on the clinic, because when they go home, we always know the patient doesn't perform. And also there is some approaches that emphasize on improvement on each session, inter-session performance improvement, getting carried away, that thinking that is a treatment effect, right? So that has very little impact. We got to look for permanent. So if you ask me, so how we will measure learning, if they actually learned or not, by doing what is called retention tests, meaning after a period of no practice, you need to see whether they are still able to maintain a certain level of performance. That is, if you're giving 6 weeks, 8 weeks of treatment, after 2 weeks of no treatment, you need to see if the patient is really able to perform well. That is the follow-up. Performance in the follow-up is key rather than performance during treatment. Right. So as I said, the key points about motor learning, that you need to know it is a process. So many factors that in what are all the what are the ingredients that is put into that process is matters in terms of achieving the outcome, that is the higher skill level in motor behavior. And one other factor, common questions as a clinician we ask is that, do capability leads to performance? That if you're better capable, you have good capacity, good strength, and good sensory aspects, and if you have, does it lead to performance? The answer is yes and no. That is, capability alone does not lead to performance. Capability implies that a skilled behavior may occur if the conditions are favorable, which means a person with a certain capability may perform well in a particular condition and not so well in another condition. So capability alone does not lead to better performance. So what does it lead to better performance? What are the other factors that influence performance? Is that the external conditions, motivation and opportunities and social support. There are many external factors that are critical to lead to performance, right? So keep that in mind. Any treatment that is focusing excessively on capacity or improving capability will not lead to improvement in performance or learning unless it is practiced within a context and contextual factors are taken into account. And again, other important point as far as learning is concerned, we cannot observe motor learning directly. It's not a physical thing you can observe. It's a construct, right? Like love, happiness, or success, you can't see it, but you can only measure by asking certain questions or by looking at certain behavior, and then we can come to a conclusion. So as I've already said, we can measure by what we call retention tests. That is a test that are done after a period of cessation of practice, right? So we need to measure if the patient has already learned. And again, just to emphasize, not to get carried away with performance that are happening in the clinic. That's not actually the end point. So as I said, quality of performance and learning we needed to look at as far as motor skills are concerned. Just I am re-emphasizing on it, right? Their skill level has to be measured when it comes to measuring. So you have the consistency, you have the different conditions, variety of conditions, and efficacy. So if you want to measure whether the patient has learned or not, patient has acquired, or how well the patient has acquired the skill, now you have to measure not just the performance, but also under varying conditions and consistency with which he is performing, and also the degree of how well he is performing. That is also is necessary. So this is what I want to leave you with. The end point, that why we are learning all of it is why our interest as physiotherapists in motor behavior is that our primary goal of physiotherapy is to promote learning or relearning of motor behaviors, that is walking, eating, and dressing, all of it. So what can improve? By practice and experience. So how you can manipulate practice, what are the different conditions of practice, the task, what task, and how you can manipulate task. There are many factors that can influence. The remaining part of remaining presentation in the symposium will focus on certain key aspects which we have identified, that is the factors that can promote learning is task complexity and variability. Contextual, this will be task complexity and variability will be explained by Smriti, and you have the next presentation would be on contextual factors by Sneha and Ananya, and you have the next other topic would be types of feedback by Asha, and practice conditions by Dollar, Pooja, and Jignasha. So we will be releasing each presentation during subsequent days after May 15. And as I've asked in my previous presentation, previous talks also, we require your encouragement and support and honest feedback. Be critical and ask any questions you find it positive, negative. Don't really worry about it. If you have a question, ask us about, put it on comment section. We will be responding. My students will be responding if necessary. I will also respond. I hope this would be a fruitful discussion and good learning. Thank you for listening. We will see you again in our next presentation.